Good morning, everybody. We are so pleased that you could join us today for this Caribbean Loss and Damage dialogue focused on loss and damage, debt, and climate justice. Certainly very, very key issues for consideration at this time. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Rueanna Haynes. I am the Director of Climate Analytics Caribbean. And just a bit of a refresher about Climate Analytics Caribbean. We are based in Trinidad and Tobago with coverage for the entire Caribbean region. And we aim to significantly augment the scientifically informed knowledge-based resources that small island developing states, or SIDS, and least developed countries in the region require to effectively address climate change. I know many of you, like me, have been on the edge of your seats with this very unpredictable hurricane season and with just a generally very, very bizarre rainy season on the whole. And of course, we know that it's still far from over. With seas that are warmer than ever, we know that more severe storms are likely on the horizon. So with these increasing climate change impacts also obviously comes loss and damage, which many countries in our region are struggling to cope with. So this project, the project that we're hosting this event under, called the Island Advancement Project, focuses on loss and damage in the Caribbean and is one of our office's seminal undertakings. It's funded by the Open Societies Foundation, and the project generally aims to raise awareness of how the global issue of loss and damage impacts Caribbean islands, significantly enhance the knowledge pool on how climate change affects the region with extensive research and analysis, and potentially increase access to the new Loss and Damage Fund and other finance by providing updated data and recommendations that would support countries in the region to be able to access that fund once it becomes operational. So the Island Advancement Project is being carried out in 14 CARICOM states, Antigua and Barbuda, Bahamas, Barbados, Belize, Dominica, Grenada, Guyana, Haiti, Jamaica, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Suriname, and Trinidad and Tobago. And today's dialogue is a key component of the program. We look forward to fostering and enriching loss and damage dialogue for government, civil society, academia, NGOs, and the private sector to share knowledge and experiences on loss and damage at the local, community, and national levels. So now on to our panelists who will share insights to improve awareness on the linkages specifically between loss and damage and fiscal debt issues for Caribbean stakeholders. At the end of this session, we hope to shape a common understanding of what debt-related solutions to address loss and damage could look like and how it can inform loss and damage strategies and actions for the Caribbean. And as some of you may know, we are in a really critical year this year as it relates to the global climate discussion, where parties to the Paris Agreement and the UN Climate Convention will be agreeing on a new collective quantified goal on climate finance. From the perspective of small island developing states and least developed countries, it would be really critical that this new goal does not only address financing for mitigation and adaptation, but also addresses financing for loss and damage, and also sets out and is able to deal with issues pertaining to debt and the relationship between debt and climate finance. And so we hope that coming out of the work on the island advancement and coming out of the discussions that we're having under this project, that we can also support the evidence base for that push for the inclusion of loss and damage in the context of that new collective goal on finance as well. So without further ado, I want to welcome our panelists and presenters, and I'll call them out so that you know who is here. We have Dr. Preeya Mohan, Senior Fellow, Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies at the University of the West Indies. Welcome, Preeya. Thank you so much for joining us. We have Dr. Ainka Granderson, Senior Technical Officer and Resilience Program Lead at the Caribbean Natural Resources Institute, a key partner for Climate Analytics Caribbean, and whose work has also been really, really valuable and seminal in this area. We have Ms. Alana Malind SN Lancaster, a lecturer in law and head of the Caribbean Environmental Law Unit at University of the West Indies, Cave Hill. Welcome, Alana. I know that your schedule is also very crowded. Thank you for taking the time. We have Ms. Sasha Jattansingh, our loss and damage expert at Climate Analytics Caribbean, who has been working very hard on island advancement. And we have Mr. 𝗗𝗵𝗆, debt management consultant, who has been working alongside Sasha to produce some of the data and information to inform the discussion here today. So Sasha will be leading us off. As part of our Climate Analytics Caribbean team, Sasha works with Caribbean small island developing states to address critical issues related to loss and damage, adaptation, and climate justice. She's a climate finance and participatory environmental governance professional with over 13 years of experience in the public, international development, and civil society sectors in Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean. Sasha is also presently an Atlantic Fellow for Social and Economic Equity at the London School of Economics. So, Sasha, we look forward to your overview of loss and damage and climate justice in the Caribbean. Thank you all. Welcome once again. And I really look forward to a transformative dialogue this morning that can bolster tangible action on addressing loss and damage in our region. So, thank you all. Sasha, the mic is yours.
Thanks so much, Rueanna, and thank you all for being here for this Caribbean loss and damage dialogue that we're hosting under Island Advancement. And I'll share my screens with the presentation. So let me know if you could see it.
We can.
Okay, great. So I am, just giving an overview of loss and damage and how it relates to climate justice and debt. And I think it's quite useful to start in, providing a bit of an overview of what loss and damage is. Just some context. And loss and damage, there's no actual official definition of loss and damage, but loss and damage could be broadly understood as the adverse impacts of climate change that occurred despite or in absence of actions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions or mitigation and to build resilience or adjust to current and future climate change or adaptation. And addressing loss and damage is considered, the third pillar of climate action, as insufficient mitigation and inadequate adaptation leads to loss and damage. And I really like the schematic from the UNFCCC, this framing of loss and damage here. And you can see there are different characteristics that define loss and damage. So loss and damage includes extreme events, which we all know, that could be hurricanes, droughts, heat waves, or it could also be slow onset events, which could be sea level rise, ocean acidification, and so on. In addition, loss and damage could also include economic loss and damage and non-economic loss and damage. And for economic loss and damage, that's anything that we're able to assign a financial value to. So, that could be loss of income, loss of agricultural yields, for example, or it could be damage to infrastructure and property. Now, for non-economic losses and damages, that's a lot harder to assign a financial value to. It's more difficult to quantify, and that could include things like loss of life or health impacts, or the loss of cultural identity, the loss of biodiversity as well. So you could see that loss and damage is quite a complex but very pertinent issue. And despite not having an official definition, there's an understanding of what loss and damage is. I'm trying to figure out why. Okay. So I think it's quite useful to just give a little overview briefly of the history of loss and damage in the international climate change negotiations. And actually, loss and damage and that concept actually came about and was proposed more than 30 years ago when the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was being negotiated, and it was proposed by Vanuatu on behalf of the Alliance of Small Island States, AOSIS, where they proposed, to have a loss and damage mechanism for small islands that were facing the impacts of sea level rise. This proposal was rejected and didn't become part of the UNFCCC, which entered into force in 1994. However, like that notion of loss and damage still existed, and you could see over the years and in different COPs how it's been included. This concept has been included up until 2015, where at COP21, the Paris Agreement was adopted. And this was the first time where we had a standalone article on loss and damage, Article 8, which secured the permanence of this issue as an issue of utmost importance. Now, tied to loss and damage is also the need for support and finance to address and respond to loss and damage by, facing climate vulnerable developing countries. And, that's been an incredibly contentious issue. And we had, debates, very, very heated debates about the need for a loss and damage finance facility. And at COP27 in 2022, a loss and damage fund and funding arrangement was established. And last year at COP28, the loss and damage fund was operationalized. And I think it's quite interesting to note that at COP27, the loss and damage fund was agreed, 2 days after the official end of the COP, whereas for the COP28, the operationalization of the loss and damage fund actually was agreed on the first day of the COP. So it really shows how important and how urgent this issue of loss and damage financing is, as Rueanna, discussed previously. And I just wanted to give a little update on the loss and damage fund. And, at COP28, when the fund was operationalized, the board of the fund was also established, and we have 2 seats for SIDS. One is Fiji and one is Antigua and Barbuda, who currently hold the SID seats. And also the fund was initially capitalized with about 660 million US. And over the course of this year, the fund board has met so far 3 times. And some of the key outcomes of these board meetings were that the fund now has an official name. It's called the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage. The fund got a home, which is in the Philippines. And the fund, as of last month, also has a new executive director, who is 𝗗𝗵𝗄𝗃, who's from Senegal. And at COP29, the recommendations from the board is expected to be agreed and approved at the COP. And there's supposed to be a final board meeting next in December in the Philippines. And this is where the actual mechanics of the fund is going to be discussed. So looking at sources of funding, we're looking at the eligibility criteria and the access modalities on how to ensure that this fund is responsive, is flexible, and is timely to really meet the needs of developing countries facing loss and damage. So it'll be quite interesting to see what happens at this at the 4th board meeting. And I mean, I gave the overview of loss and damage in the UNFCCC, but I think it's quite important to include and to go deeper into what do we mean by loss and damage and climate justice, and give a more Caribbean perspective to this. So we have to first understand what loss and damage is. And loss and damage is a concept that addresses the just division, fair sharing, and equitable distribution of the benefits and burdens of climate change and responsibilities to deal with climate change. And climate justice highlights that the causes and impacts of climate change are neither distributed nor experienced equally, and that there are structural, systemic, and historical factors that have led to these inequities. So for decades, climate change has been framed as, a purely environmental or physical problem with relatively straightforward causes and effects. So humans emit greenhouse gases. These greenhouse gases cause global warming and environmental change. And a changed environment then negatively affects people. So for years, a lot of the attention has been largely paid to, finding technical solutions. How can greenhouse gases be reduced? And what are some adaptation options that could actually reduce climate risks? But when we consider climate justice, you realize that this logic no longer holds and exposes the fact that the causes and effects of climate change are far more complex and require much more nuanced and inclusive approaches. And with that being said, in the Caribbean, climate justice is a critical lens to understand inequalities and inequities and how they influence the way in which climate change is experienced in this region and in SIDS as well. And it's important to note that SIDS are responsible for less than 1% of global greenhouse gas emissions, but we are among the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, despite being the least responsible. And it's for this, this fact that climate justice, has framed how SIDS and Caribbean SIDS have engaged with the international climate change negotiations. And climate change is an existential threat to the Caribbean. And since 2009, small island developing states and many others have been calling for limiting global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels to prevent the worst of climate change impacts. And the inclusion of a 1.5 degree temperature limit in the Paris Agreement in 2015 was a major victory for vulnerable countries like small island developing states. And, I'm showing these pictures, which a lot of you would know. It's the 1.5, it's from the 1.5 to Stay Alive campaign, which actually was developed right here in the Caribbean, and it's just taken off, become like a clarion call.
$882.
For the need for climate justice, and the need for why climate change is an existential threat to SIDS and why this is an important issue. And then with that perspective, we have to look at that linkage between loss and damage and climate justice. And loss and damage, and in particular, loss and damage finance, is an important climate justice issue that SIDS, including Caribbean SIDS, have advocated for at the international climate negotiations. And, this culminated in the establishment and the operationalization of the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage. It is a mouthful, this new name. And it's just to note that right now, the initial capitalization is around 700 million US. And that, to be fair, that's a lot of money, but it does not meet the scale and the urgency of the problem of loss and damage, current and future loss and damage that is affecting, highly vulnerable countries like small island developing states here in the Caribbean, like least developed countries. And just for, perspective, when Hurricane Maria, plummeled through Dominica in 2017, the estimated losses and damages for that country was about 1.2 billion US, which is about 226% of Dominica's GDP. And this estimated loss and damage is, we have to recognize the fact that this 1.2 billion US was for one country affected by one climate event in 1 year. So we could see that the amount of money currently in the fund is clearly insufficient to really tackle the scale and the urgency of the problem, and why it is that we are, like SIDS and so on, are advocating for the need for much more financing for loss and damage. And this is why it's quite important that when we go into COP, which we're calling the finance COP, since we're negotiating the new collective quantified goal on climate finance, that there will be an actual inclusion of loss and damage finance within that goal to really help address the need for adequate financing for loss and damage. And, we've discussed all of that, loss and damage and climate justice, but I think it's quite important to understand why did this happen and why is the Caribbean in particular so vulnerable to climate change and loss and damage. And this excerpt is from an article by Dr. Leon Seeley Huggins called 1.5 to Stay Alive, Climate Change, Imperialism and Justice for the Caribbean. It's 2017, so it's relatively old, but I think it's highly relevant, and I definitely encourage you all to read it. I put the link on the slide. And it says the reliance of many Caribbean economies on sectors that are threatened by climate change, notably tourism, agriculture, and fishing, is not merely a feature of geography, but a condition with historical antecedents precipitated by countries' insertion into a vastly unequal global system of relations post-independence. And that's a mouthful, but when you really, unpack what this means, what we're saying is that Caribbean countries have, defining characteristics which really highlight our high vulnerability to climate change and which stem from our shared colonial and imperialist histories. And some of these characteristics include the fact that the Caribbean countries have high levels of fiscal debt. We're one of the most indebted regions in the world. We also have a high reliance on imported goods. We also have food security within the region. A high percentage of our population and assets are located along our coast. And we also are dependent economically on climate vulnerable sectors. And what we're seeing here is that these characteristics are, systemic, and they're caused by centuries of exploitation due to colonialism. So the question is, how can Caribbean countries reduce these deeply ingrained climate vulnerabilities while also ensuring sustainable development and economic prosperity? And it's important to know that this is where climate justice could be used as a framework for climate action for SIDS and for the Caribbean region. And we have to note that climate injustices exist at all levels, from globally down to the local level. And loss and damage is unequally distributed, and it's disproportionately experienced by those who are least able to respond to climate change. And as a region that is facing climate injustice at the global level, we should not continue to perpetuate these injustices within our countries and within our communities. So when we're developing climate change responses, policies, actions, projects, we should seek to prioritize just and equitable approaches that do not further worsen existing inequalities, and should also seek to recognize and address these injustices. And I think that's quite important to have that framework of how we could apply climate justice to climate action that's needed for the Caribbean. But before we even get there, we need to understand, what is the state of play in terms of loss and damage. And in June this year, we had launched a report called a Review of Loss and Damage in the Caribbean, 1994 to 2024. And I put the link up. And why we decided to do this report is that despite the widespread loss and damage that's been experienced throughout the Caribbean, we didn't have any sort of comprehensive assessment of loss and damage in the region. Some of the research questions were, how was loss and damage being framed in the region? What were the existing tools, methodologies, and so on that we used to assess and report on loss and damage? What was the extent of loss and damage that has been experienced in the region? And what are the projected future costs of loss and damage for the region? And it's quite important to know what is the state of play, what is there, before we could go about looking at what are some of the solutions to loss and damage. And what we saw is that this real link between debt and how we respond to loss and damage, especially in the Caribbean. So with that, I want to say thank you so much. And definitely I look forward to a really engaging discussion with everybody here. So thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Sasha. Those are really important insights and developments, and 100% agree that it's really important to get a proper assessment of what exactly loss and damage is, how it's impacting our region, and a better understanding of the linkages between loss and damage and climate justice. That's the only way that we can really ensure that the response really meets the needs of our vulnerable regions. So ladies and gentlemen, just a quick introduction. I'm 𝗗𝗵𝗴𝗲, the communications lead for Climate Analytics Caribbean. Thank you so much for being here. I would also just like you to note our question and answer segment will be coming up. So save your questions, put them in the chats. We really look forward to engaging with all of you. Before that, I would like now to put the spotlight on Mr. 𝗗𝗵𝗴𝗲, our debt management consultant for Climate Analytics Caribbean. Kevin is a development specialist and economist working on policy and project-oriented programs with Caribbean institutions, including the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, the OECS, the Caribbean Development Bank, the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank, and the government of Trinidad and Tobago. He is an adjunct lecturer at the University of the West Indies in the Masters in International Trade Policy program. He is also an economics lecturer at the 𝗗𝗵𝗆 Island campus in Antigua and Barbuda. Kevin is also an economics PhD candidate with Bournemouth University in the UK. Kevin, we look forward to hearing your findings on loss and damage and debt sustainability, a Caribbean perspective.
Thank you, Bianca. Just confirming that you're hearing me clearly.
All good.
And also thank you, Sasha, for the review on loss and damage. I'm going to share my screen, colleagues. Just give me a sec. All right, thank you. So this presentation, colleagues, I just want to sort of do a dive into the intersection between climate change, loss and damage, and debt sustainability in the Caribbean, in the English-speaking Caribbean in particular. We would explore different impacts of climate change on our islands. Sasha would have given a comprehensive overview on loss and damage, but for me, I just wanted to reinforce what is highlighted with respect to loss and damage, referring to, at least from how I position this presentation, the adverse impacts of climate change that cannot be avoided through mitigation or adaptation. She highlighted both economic and non-economic loss. And of interest, she also highlighted, obviously, where we have similar characteristics in the Caribbean, in the English-speaking Caribbean and the Greater Caribbean at large, in terms of high import dependence, in terms of low, a number of our productive enterprises and sectors are along the coastline, and as such makes them susceptible to a number of these events, extreme weather events, make them susceptible to sea level rises, and equally ecosystem degradation. So here you just have some insights, and I would sort of just do a little for the peeling back of the onion. So with respect to climate change and debt sustainability, it's important to note that there is research to date that has been done on climate change, and there's ongoing work that is being done on debt sustainability. And now, to a large extent, a number of our international financial agencies, regional NGOs, and others are now working on looking at that parallel, at that intersection between the two. And I'm going to attempt today just to highlight and to demonstrate that relationship between the two. We also have instances where a number of studies have shown that in the medium to long term, we can expect climate change to negatively impact our medium-term economic growth, with potential reduction in our gross domestic product in terms of the production of goods and services in our countries by as much as 9 to 12% up to 2050. And this is on the assumption that if we continue as business as usual, we can anticipate a reduction in economic activity of as much as 9 to 12% by 2050. And assuming we are currently on average within CARICOM trending around 2.5 to 3% gross domestic product year on year, you could appreciate and understand what that means in terms of livelihoods, in terms of well-being. Because again, we want to anchor this discussion on loss and damage, not only with respect to the economics, but really how the household is impacted. We could also anticipate an increase in frequency and severity of extreme climatic events. We've seen evidence thereof in terms of Hurricane Beryl and a number of the other storms that followed within the 2024 period, for which we're still a part of. And I would sort of highlight at least some initial data that came out from that impact on one of the case study countries that we're looking at. So with respect to debt sustainability, I'll go a little further in, but just to say that one could anticipate that whenever there are particularly, let's say, extreme weather events, in this case, because we do have a lot of data in that respect, the cost of disaster recovery, adaptation measures, among others, put huge challenge on the public purse. And just by way, when our governments in the region are spending upwards of 30 to 40 cents of every dollar on debt servicing, even before these extreme events, you could appreciate in terms of monies not being allocated for productive expenditure with respect to health, education, and even other productive activities. So you could start to appreciate that we sort of have what one would consider to be a vicious cycle, especially when a hurricane or a natural hazard, or even if there's a flooding event that would occur in a number of the territories for which we are currently conducting the research. To compound this, you could also appreciate that when we look at the investments required by a number of the countries in terms of their national determined contribution for mitigation and adaptation, these estimates are anywhere between 5 to 10% of gross domestic product per year. So this is really the annual investment countries are required to make to mitigate and to adapt to climate change. So again, the costs associated with mitigation and adaptation in terms of investment also have implications with respect to the strain that it places on a country's debt dynamics, especially given that most of these resources, depending on the country, countries are expected to borrow to be able to invest for mitigation and adaptation. So I just want you to appreciate that there's a sort of vicious cycle of living in a bad neighborhood for many of us who live, reside, work, and have leisure in the Caribbean. So we're speaking of a region that already have limited fiscal capacity to respond to climate shocks, right? And also at present, a number of our countries are undergoing what we call fiscal consolidation measures with an intention of trying to reduce the impact, for example, of one of the most recent hazards we faced, which was the COVID-19 pandemic. So when you compound that with the recent passage of Hurricane Beryl and others, you could appreciate, the strain on the public purse. And I just wanted to reinforce that, colleagues. So of interest, I don't want to bore you with the mathematical equation on your right, but this is of importance. This equation is really telling you what we use when we look at debt sustainability. And what it is saying is that debt sustainability, which is B over PY, and the B here represents debt, public debt over your gross domestic product, is really a function of changes in a country's interest rates, in economic growth, in a country's budget, a budget deficit, or we would say budget balance. And there are other things that could affect it in terms of exchange rates and also unforeseen shocks, let's say, contingent liabilities. But suffice to say, at least for those who may want to take up the challenge today, for us to look at it mathematically, for debt sustainability to occur, colleagues, it means that the debt to GDP ratio needs to be equal to 0 or is declining. And as such, the RT minus GT, which is what we call your interest growth differential, the interest rate growth differential, means that if our economic activity is accelerating faster than the cost of borrowing, which is your interest rate, then your debt to GDP ratio would be declining. And similarly, which is GT minus T, which speaks to your public purse, which is your fiscal balance over PY, is saying, so just to say, debt sustainability is a situation where that equation is equal to 0 or is declining. And as such, once we have situations where our growth is accelerating faster than our interest rate or cost of borrowing, or equally, governments are balancing their budgets and are generating surpluses, then we are in a sustainable situation. One would say a country is experiencing fiscal prudence or experiencing or practicing fiscal prudence. The absence thereof, colleagues, when you have a situation where we have successive climatic shocks and you're going to the market to borrow, which is putting pressure on your cost of borrowing, your interest rates, and at the same time having implications on reducing your economic activity, we could see a situation where your public debt to GDP ratio would be accelerating at a faster pace and would pose what we call risk of debt overhang. And in situations like this, that vicious cycle continues. Countries are going to lose or going to be rated poorly in terms of their sovereign credit rating, which increases their cost of borrowing. And we could be facing a situation where we have to course correct. And course correction really means, one, again, trying to reduce the limited productive expenditure to finance debt, or alternatively, trying to increase taxation on an economic base that may be small in most of our island states. So I hope I've sort of given you a quick immersion in public debt, right? And again, as I say here, as listed, climate change impact, increased borrowing, higher debt levels, reduced fiscal space, increased vulnerability. Also, I wanted, at the time we started this research, we were pre-Hurricane Beryl. And at the time, with the data that was available, we just wanted to show, we just wanted to show where countries are in terms of their risk of debt distress in addition to their debt levels. So you could appreciate, again, just reinforcing the point that post-COVID-19 pandemic, a health crisis that we've been responding to, countries were already either at a moderate to high level of debt distress, right? And with respect to the passage of beryl, especially the countries, Jamaica, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Grenada, and even Barbados, you could appreciate the impact that would have on debt, on their sovereign debt. And I would show or illustrate such in a later slide. We also, as Sasha mentioned, the interest and importance for us is to be able to try to find different data sets, both that is accessible internationally, regionally, and locally, to be able to have a proper understanding and better metric as to what we're treating with loss and damage. So one of the data source that is available, open source, and gives you sufficient data from 1995 to present is the Notre Dame Global Adaptation Initiative Country Index. And what this is, it's really try to measure the overall vulnerability of the countries with respect to 6 life supporting sectors: food, water, health, ecosystem, service, human habitat, and infrastructure. And what you see next to the country are their ranking. And these countries are ranked out of 182 countries. And of the 4 countries illustrated, within CARICOM, we recognize that they are ranked in excess of 100 and equally trending closer to the more highly vulnerable, climate vulnerable countries. And this is just to illustrate, colleagues, that within the region, we are, and again, the lower the score on the ranking, which is the vulnerability score, the lower your ranking, and equally the lower the exposure to climate change impacts. So basically what I'm saying is our territories are highly exposed to climate change impacts and are equally, so you could appreciate why the Caribbean to a large extent is oftentimes leading discussions around loss and damage, climate change, the Barbados Initiative, among other things, which is really to try to attract more financing to facilitate mitigation and adaptation, colleagues. So I would dive into this at the country level because I have a little illustration for 4 countries. But suffice to say, our territory's economic structure are predominantly tourism and agriculture. We do have resource-rich countries, more to the south, Southern Caribbean. But when you think of it, our infrastructure, agriculture, and tourism sectors are oftentimes among the more exposed when it comes to climate change and when it comes to issues surrounding loss and damage, colleagues. I already spoke a little bit about this, and obviously our dependence on sectors that are susceptible to climate change, being tourism and agriculture. And I also spoke a little bit about this in terms of that vicious cycle of debt accumulation when I sort of share with you the equation on debt sustainability. All right, but again, just to reinforce, increased borrowing to finance recovery efforts, reduce economic output contributes to that vicious cycle, colleagues. And how do we break that cycle? 1, it has to be cheaper and more concessional financing, greater access to grants and other resources, initiatives like debt clauses that would allow us to have some breathing space and debt restructuring, among others. So it has to be an entire transformation of our countries, how we undertake debt, how we finance investments in infrastructure, in addition to finance economic activities in tourism and agriculture. I want to just share with you, sorry. So this is instructive, colleagues, before I go into the country slides, the country cases. But if you look at the bottom, your bottom right with respect to Dominica. Dominica, as Sasha shared, experienced a situation of their Hurricane Maria being upwards of 226% thereabouts of its gross domestic product. But what preceded Hurricane Maria was Tropical Storm Erica in 2015, which was upwards close to, I think, about 90% of their gross domestic product. And on your right-hand side, where you see general government debt to GDP, the year of the eventee shows in both cases that their debt levels was modest, or probably from my memory was actually declining. They were actually trending towards debt sustainability. And just two successive shocks within the space of 4 years resulted in their public debt to GDP adjusting upwards, and now is in a situation of debt distress due to the fact of reduced economic activity and, by extension, government borrowing and financing of redevelopment reconstruction, colleagues. So in the paper that we are working on to complete, we will have more insights in this. And we are also taking into account the recent passage of Hurricane Beryl. We are doing some select countries just to illustrate due to data availability, but we target those countries again, colleagues, based on the vulnerability to climate change using the Notre Dame metric or criteria. Sasha spoke about Hurricane Maria with respect to Dominica. We had the effect of Hurricane Irma in Antigua, which caused great havoc and devastation on the island of Barbuda. And we saw estimated damages of around 223 million USD. Antigua was already in a situation of high debt, and as such, the cost of recovery and reconstruction, coupled with their existing debt levels, obviously put pressure on debt sustainability, in addition to the impact that would have had on tourism and, well, in the case of Barbuda, fisheries output. But basically, again, when these sectors are affected, it affects household, colleagues. On one hand, we're speaking about issues with respect to livelihood, the loss of housing, the issues with respect to employment, issues with respect to food security. And while it's difficult to actually measure in terms of a dollar value, when we think of climate-induced displacement with respect to the 1,500 Barbudans who had to relocate to Antigua during the reconstruction phase, that leads not only to an economic cost for housing and shelter, but equally costs related to health, to mental health, among others, to loss of learning deficits with respect to losses for education, etc. And these are the type of information we're trying to collect during our country engagement with some of these countries to give a better appreciation as to the real costs or experience with respect to loss and damage in the selected countries. In Belize, also we sought to try to get a case study country more south of the region. So Belize also has similar in terms of Belize exposure, but again, we see evidence there that Belize suffer a lot with recurrent flooding that creates damages to housing, crops, and infrastructure, being both tourist and agriculture dependent. But one of the challenges we have across all 4 countries has to do with the lack of data. With respect to Dominica, I saw the preface Dominica, and I also illustrated Dominica in the chat. And in closing, with respect to St. Vincent and the Grenadines, so I just wanted to highlight, for example, the recent passage of Hurricane Beryl. We do have Grenada as one of the case study country, but I just opted to put up St. Vincent just for your information. So we have a situation where, while hurricanes is, what we would get a lot of attention from, we still have instances a lot of times when there is tropical depression in a number of our countries, especially in the Eastern Caribbean, where the impact of rainfall over 2-3 hours could lead to significant devastation. The case in point, the 2013-2016 floods, upwards of 15 to 17% of GDP. And when you compare that to a category 4 Hurricane Beryl, you see the impact of 22% of GDP. I'm not trying to say that flooding is more important than a category 4 hurricane, but I'm just trying to give you an idea that as simple as 2 hours of rainfall could have significant impact on a number of the countries that we're looking at. Similarly, we have a situation where there are over 4,500 people displaced and living in multiple shelters across the island of St. Vincent due to the impact that Hurricane Beryl had on the Grenadine Islands of Canada and Union Island. I would close with this slide just to say that there are a series of initiatives ongoing at the regional level and international level, where there are initiatives trying to attract more innovative finance, of which the Loss and Damage Fund is part of that innovation. We also have initiatives at the country level. We also have instances where countries are now setting up their climate resilience funds and also funding such, with the situation in Grenada and Dominica in terms of funding some of it from their revenues. There are ongoing initiatives to improve disaster risk management and also trying to get contingent financing and different insurance opportunities available so they could respond faster to reduce the impact. And at present, we know we have the ongoing meetings, annual meetings at the IMF and World Bank. There are a series of initiatives being led by the multilateral development banks and international financial agencies. So in closing, we have colleagues in 2004. I'm not sure how many of us are familiar with CRIF. CRIF being the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility. And CRIF was actually an innovation that came out of the passage of Hurricane Ivan in Grenada. We also have in the Caribbean also piloted and introduced the debt pause clause, which really speaks to, should you be impacted by a natural hazard, in new debt instruments, you now could have a situation for a duration of your recovery period where you're not servicing your debt obligations. And we've seen that piloted in Grenada. We also see evidence of that in Barbados post their debt restructuring in 2018. So over to you, colleagues, and thank you for listening.
Thanks so much, Kevin, for your very comprehensive and very, I would say, approachable and understandable, presentation on, the linkages between loss and damage and debt sustainability in the Caribbean. I think I've been getting feedback from like audience members saying that, thank you so much. They're able to understand, very, very heavy topic, this very, very heavy topic of like debt and loss and damage a bit better from your presentation. So I think thanks so much, Kevin, for that. And I think now we're actually on to a short question and answer session. So, to the audience, it's time for, your voices to be heard. So we want to hear your questions on, what was presented so far and on the critical issues related to loss and damage and debt sustainability in the Caribbean. So you could feel free to raise your hand and then we'll call upon you, or you could feel free to provide your questions or comments in the chat. So yeah, looking forward to the questions and comments. And so what I'll do is I'll ask Jewel if she could just check in the chat if there's a question, like any questions. And I see that Denise Burris has her hand up. So I don't know if I pronounce your name properly, but Denise, feel free to provide your question or comment.
Good morning, all. Thank you. This has been a very, it's been an exciting presentation, and I was pleased to hear both presenters this morning. I have a question in relation to the COP and the debt financing. I'm just wondering if access to that fund, if we already know, if it can be made by individual companies who may have suffered a loss as a result as a climate activity, or would it be limited to countries making that application?
So thanks for that, Denise. And I know that's a very relevant question. A lot of people and organizations and so on are very much interested in understanding how to access the loss and damage fund. And right now, that those sorts of operational procedures are still to be negotiated and decided upon, but there are different access modalities that have been presented. Of course, there'll be, they've been pushing for direct access for countries, also to have a direct access modality, a small grants window where, vulnerable communities and civil society are able to access the fund. As currently, there's no sort of I think so far the fund doesn't extend to private sector because it's focused on vulnerable countries, so the national level, and then also saying how we can have direct access to the hardest hit communities.
Thank
So
you.
I hope that helps.
Sasha, the question that was in the chat was along similar lines, so I think you answered it.
No problem. So any other questions or comments?
I see a question here from Ainka for
Sure.
Kevin. Is debt forgiveness not also an important option? I recently attended another talk on debt that noted that some of our most indebted countries, like Dominica, are possibly facing insolvency issues, and way forward requires forgiveness or cancellation of debt as part of the approach.
So all you have to think of debt management and how we tackle this as a menu of options. So the answer to your question is yes. Debt forgiveness, debt refinancing, debt for climate swaps. We've seen evidence, regrettably due to time, but the research would show the example of Belize utilizing a proportion of their debt where they swapped it to actually make investments in climate adaptation and mitigation. So there is a menu of options, of which debt forgiveness ought to be one. I think, however, we have to still understand the political economy factors that occur at these meetings. And again, we've seen evidence, for example, a number of our member governments are part of the whole ALBA Bank, where they have relationship with Venezuela. And you would have seen instances, Jamaica, Antigua and Barbuda, and I think even Dominica, to my knowledge, I would have to confirm, but they would have benefited from some debt forgiveness as a proportion of their obligations to ALBA.
And I think if we don't have any other questions, we can actually
We do, Sasha.
Okay.
Danielle Myers has her hand up.
Sure. Go ahead, Danielle.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you all for the presentations this morning. I figure Kevin might be the best person for this question. I was hoping just for a bit more elaboration about how debt for climate swaps work, in terms of how they're structured. If you can give me a bit more, if you could elaborate a little more, if that's all right. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So debt for climate swaps, it's a situation where, so you have the nature transparency. So you have a situation where the debtor country, right, has, the case of Belize, has debt that's accelerating, huge high level of public debt. You have an intermediary, and in this case, I think it's the Nature Conservancy is the agent, and you have your commitments that you make in terms of your national determined contributions, among other stuff, or any environmental commitments that you make. So the debtor country is seeking to negotiate that by taking a proportion of their debt, right, and trading it to, or more or less getting forgiveness of that debt, that they can take some agreed amount to use it for investments in environmental, in terms of environmental related investments. So it's a contract, it's an agreement for which you're trading a proportion of your debt in relation to be able to make the type of investments in adaptation and mitigation.
Thanks so much, Kevin. And just to let everybody know, this is the end of this first Q&A session, and there will be a lot more time where people could ask questions, and we'll have them responded to during the plenary session. So thanks so much for these very thought-provoking and relevant questions. And now I want to move on to our panel discussion towards a common approach for addressing loss and damage and debt sustainability in the Caribbean. And I'd like the panelists to please turn on their videos so people could see who you are. And I'll just give a brief introduction of each of them before I start the panel. So firstly, I'd like to introduce the panelists who will, be joining Kevin. And firstly, we have Dr. Preeya Mohan, who is a senior fellow at the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine campus. And Dr. Mohan has made significant contributions to the field of development economics. She has been awarded several research grants and has worked on various projects funded by international bodies. And she was also recently awarded an inaugural 𝗟𝗏 Huq Scholarship and Award for Loss and Damage Research. Her work has significantly influenced policy development and decision-making in the region, informing government policies and initiatives related to climate change, disaster risk reduction, and sustainable development. And next we have Dr. Ainka Granderson, Senior Technical Officer and Resilience Program Lead at the Caribbean Natural Resources Institute. Ainka is a foremost expert on climate change and environmental management in the Caribbean and Pacific small island developing states. And at CANARI, she oversees the portfolio of projects on climate change and disaster resilience. Ainka is also a trained climate adaptation specialist and also has experience in climate finance access and delivery in the SIDS context. And Ainka and I were former colleagues at CANARI, so I'm really glad to have Ainka as part of this panel. And lastly, we have Ms. Alana Malin Lancaster, who is a lecturer in law and the head of the Caribbean Environmental Law Unit at the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill. And Alana is a Guyanese Barbadian environmental, energy, and human rights lawyer, as well as an academic and natural resource specialist. Alana has contributed extensively to the work of international bodies, courts, and the work of the special rapporteurs on human rights and climate change, the right to a healthy environment, and the special rapporteur on economic, social, cultural, and environmental rights. And, I want to welcome everyone to this panel. And I just want to provide a reminder to our audience to, keep adding your questions and comments in the chat during the panel discussion. We will be responding to them in the open plenary. So, without further ado, let's dive in. And firstly, I want to, call on Alana for the first question. And, in the two presentations by myself and Kevin, we were discussing, loss and damage and debt, given an overview of that. But My question to you is, why are small island developing states most affected by loss and damage and high fiscal debt burdens? And why is this a climate justice issue?
Thank you very much, Sasha, and thank you for inviting me to this very important panel discussion. I think both you and Kevin painted a lot of the context in which we find ourselves in the Caribbean, well, SIDS in general. And one of the things, and I can share this later, when I was preparing for this, I was doing a bit of background research as to why SIDS are so deeply affected in terms of human rights and the climate justice. And one of the things that popped out to me is the gap or the deep difference between the impacts, both slow and fast onset, as well as economic and non-economic loss on Caribbean SIDS. We are by far the most impacted, and a lot of this has to do with our inherent characteristics, where we found location-wise and also our resilience in terms of, I think recently we would have heard the Grenadian Prime Minister in the news indicating that it took about 10 years to get over Ivan, and just when you were getting over one storm, another one comes. Now these impacts of storms, you have sea level rise, we have droughts and so on, have impacts on a broad suite of human rights, ranging from, right to health, right to a healthy environment, right to food, education. So both economic as well as social and political rights. And most recently, it has been highlighted that this also impacts on our right to development. So in other words, loss and damage linked to climate change is directly impacting states as a whole, the SIDS as a whole, right to development. And in depriving states of that right, you're also depriving the most vulnerable persons in society. And often this includes, women, children, indigenous and Afro-descendant groups, depending on which state this is, as well as persons with disabilities. And of course, Kevin referenced the example, persons who are displaced. Migrants also become vulnerable persons. So and we can talk further about this. How does this become a climate justice issue? Well, one of the things that is, from a global perspective, as I mentioned, there are great disproportionalities and disparities even among SIDS, but between SIDS and also other developing states. But even within SIDS, you have many disparities. So it's a kind of like the vulnerable of the vulnerable. Now, what, for example, the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Development has proposed is we need to locate our responses not only in economic, because clearly this has to be located in economic, and as I will mention, also SIDS are taking a leadership in legal approaches, but in addition to the UNFCCC policy framework, the COPs and so on, we need to locate it in a climate justice framework, because this incorporates many of the human rights, but also can link to what he calls a rainbow of measures related to loss and damage. In particular, one which you would have mentioned in detail, Sasha, the Loss and Damage Fund, and that this climate justice approach should be reflected in how the fund is operationalized. So that is one very important aspect. I think the ones I also want to throw out there already mentioned, one already mentioned by Kevin, is the debt for nature swaps and debt for climate swaps. So in other words, thinking of other out of the box approaches, because we have to come at this issue from a variety of angles. In the aftermath of Hurricane Beryl, we had the prime ministers of Antigua and Barbuda, Grenada, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines proposing a Marshall Plan of sorts from the United Kingdom. So this is fully having, I guess, taken stock of our colonial relationship and how that has impacted or put us in a position that makes us more vulnerable. We also have the restructuring of the international financial system. So we have Barbados proposing the Bridgetown Initiative 3.0, France and Vanuatu, so which are France was Vanuatu's colonial or main colonial country. They've proposed something called the 𝗖𝗶𝗆 Plan for Action. There's also linking business to a human rights approach, and one major agreement in our neck of the woods is the 𝗟𝗀𝘀𝘀 agreement, because this allows for participatory rights. And what I mean by participatory rights is having communities, people involved in decision making and being able to, most importantly, seek redress. Well, maybe importantly, I suppose, because I look at it from a legal point of view. And finally, we've had SIDS, I guess, a bit frustrated with the UNFCCC process, take the lead in two very important actions we have going on globally. So the first was a request for an advisory opinion to the International Tribunal to the Law of the Sea, which was led by a Caribbean small island developing state and a Pacific small island developing state. And then we had so that advisory opinion has been rendered. In December, from December the 2nd to the 13th, we will have the advisory opinion before the International Court of Justice, the hearings for that. And this was championed by Vanuatu. And again, this very long road to this, which I can also get into. In our closer to us in Latin America, even though Caribbean states are not largely part of this court, the Inter-American courts, and I think even though we are not states, this will influence our negotiation and other relationships, which Caribbean states, when they negotiate like on the climate change, biodiversity, and so on, they usually negotiate with AOSIS as well as the GRULAC, which is the Group Latin America and the Caribbean. So I think in a nutshell, I of course feel free to ask me questions and I can elaborate on or on anything else.
But thank you so much, Alana, for really bringing this, trying to situate loss and damage and looking at like the fiscal debt burden in like this legal framework, and understanding how we could use climate justice as a framework for climate action, and the importance of having like a human rights-based approach to dealing with loss and damage in the Caribbean. And I'm glad you mentioned the various advisory opinions that's happening, to just note that climate justice has really helped to drive momentum on this issue of loss and damage, on why SIDS are so highly vulnerable. So instead of us going to, formally, it would have just been the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement and the COPs, where we would have our only means of discussion or recourse. We're seeing it opening up to other avenues through the ICJ, through the court for the ITLOS, through, right now we have the IMF and the World Bank annual meetings happening, where they are discussing, debt restructuring and the reform of the international financial reform agenda. So you're seeing that climate justice has really helped to broaden these spaces where we could discuss and really get leverage on action for how do we deal with climate justice and debt. So I just want to say thank you for your comments, and looking forward to you being part of the discussion later on. So next I want to move on to Preeya, and Preeya, just based on your experience in climate finance, I just wanted to ask you, how can the new fund for responding to loss and damage be more responsive to addressing the twin issues of loss and damage and debt distress faced by climate vulnerable countries and communities? And how can climate finance support dealing with loss and damage and debt distress, specifically in small island developing states like here in the Caribbean?
Thank you, Sasha. I want to thank Climate Analytics and the entire team for the opportunity to present. I think Kevin and you, Sasha, would have done excellent presentations at the beginning to really set the stage for the discussion now. So some of what I say may actually overlap with what was said before. Now, this question can actually be an entire paper. So I'll try to do my best to be as brief as possible in responding. But before I actually respond directly to the question, I first want to make the point about loss and damage and debt. So there is this belief, there is a narrative out there that climate change may not be the primary driver of debt in small island developing states or in the Caribbean region. But climate change is just one among many factors. And, COVID-19 has proven that to some extent. But I want to say that there is empirical evidence for the Caribbean that disasters do, in fact, increase our debt. And the work that you and Kevin do is exactly trying to show that. And I think we need to highlight the research from the Caribbean showing the link between debt and climate change. So in my own work, a paper, Mohan and 𝗟𝗶𝗃 2021, we show a clear link between tropical storm damage and rise in debt to GDP ratios in the Eastern Caribbean countries. In fact, we show that the average tropical storm would increase the debt to GDP ratio in these countries by 8%. Now, that's a significant amount if it's the average storm. Now, if we look at severe events during the time period of our study, we would see that a severe event can increase debt to GDP ratio by as much as 132%. So there is the evidence out there, and these rising debt burdens can contribute to the severe climate injustice out there. So again, I'm going into the climate justice space, as Alana would have just spoken into, but given our minimal contributions to greenhouse gas emissions, we bear the brunt of the consequences of climate change. And this is particularly concerning as we now grapple with the twin challenges of loss and damage and debt distress. What we need to do going forward as a region is to expand our research efforts. So while we do have some compelling evidence, we need more studies to fully understand the complex relationship between climate change, disasters, and loss and damage and debt in our region. And these studies can then provide us with the evidence we need to develop effective strategies in accessing the Loss and Damage Fund and in accessing international climate finance. So now let's look at the Loss and Damage Fund and how we can make it more responsive to addressing loss and damage and debt distress in the region. Now, we have been lobbying for over 30 years, as the presentation showed before, for this Loss and Damage Fund. So this fund does represent, a crucial step for addressing climate events on vulnerable communities. Now, unlike climate finance or climate aid, which is supposed to address future impacts through mitigation and adaptation, there is this gap of the immediate impact from disasters. How are we going to fund the relief, the cleanup, the reconstruction following a disaster? After disaster, immediate access to finance is what's required. And this is the gap that we're hoping that the Loss and Damage Fund is going to fill. Now, how do we make the fund more accessible? There can be a lot of parallels between the Loss and Damage Fund and the issue of accessing international climate finance that we want to avoid going forward in the dialogue in terms of shaping how we access the fund. So there are issues about how much there is in the fund. Sasha made the point that clearly the amount now is not sufficient. Similarly, with international climate finance, that $100 billion target, we have not met it yet, or we have barely met it. So how much is in the fund? The access criteria for the fund. So most SIDS are classified as high-income countries. Sorry, most Caribbean SIDS are classified as high-income countries. And this has disadvantaged us in terms of accessing international climate finance. So we need to be very careful about the criteria of accessing the Loss and Damage Fund and how we access those funds. How are we going to report loss and damage, etc., in accessing these funds? These are all issues we need to figure out going forward. So I'm going to speak more in terms of the how we access the funds in terms of answering the question. So before we can even begin to access the funds, loss and damage funds, we need to be able to conduct comprehensive assessments of both our economic and non-economic losses from climate-related events. This includes damages from infrastructure and ecosystems to loss of livelihoods. We must have a clear and detailed understanding of the full extent of our losses. And this is essential to establish credibility and for building a strong case in accessing the funds. And again, through the work of climate analytics, through Kevin and Sasha, we see that this work is being done, but there's a lot to do. So in addition to having these accurate measurements of loss and damage, we must be able to prepare detailed proposals outlining our specific needs and the estimated costs and a clear plan of how the funds are going to be used. Now, this requires technical expertise. This requires careful planning. This requires careful coordination among government agencies and stakeholders in our region. Now, after we've actually received funding, it is then imperative for us to demonstrate transparency and accountability in how we use the funds. So this includes providing regular reports, progress on projects, and ensuring that the funds are being used effectively to address the identified losses. Because we want to give donors the confidence that the funds are being used for the purpose that we say the funds are going to be used. Now, I say all of this to make the point that accessing the Loss and Damage Fund is not a simple process. It requires careful planning, meticulous documentation, and a commitment to transparency and accountability. And we in the region, we need to be prepared to invest in the capacity building, in the data collection building to ensure that our region can meet the challenges in accessing the fund and utilizing the funds in a way that really builds climate resilience in our region. Now, what are some of the features of the fund that can help us make the fund more responsive? Well, the fund should probably have a parametric trigger. And what this simply means is that if a disaster occurs, there must be some kind of criteria where we're able to access the funds. And a parametric trigger would be some sort of criteria based on the expected damage from an event. So whether it's based on wind speed, so the expected damage from the wind speed of a hurricane or the expected damage from the potential rainfall from an event should trigger a payment from the fund. And why parametric triggers are important is that parametric triggers allow for the immediate access of funds. Unlike estimating funds post-event, that's going to take time to survey to understand the extent of the disaster. Parametric triggers allow for the access of the funds immediately as the event occurs. And when a disaster occurs, immediate upfront liquidity is what we need to save lives and livelihoods. Now, this parametric trigger is not coming from me alone. It's not coming out of just one person. We have Resi out of the ODI also asking for these parametric triggers to be included in the fund. Now, parametric triggers are not something new to us in the Caribbean. We've actually pioneered parametric triggers, as Kevin spoke about the CRIF. Parametric insurance came out of the Caribbean, out of IVAN. And so I feel confident that as a region, we can lobby for parametric triggers in accessing the loss and damage fund as we go towards operationalizing the fund.
And so I'm so sorry, Preeya, but we're running out of time. But I just want to say thank you for your response and really highlighting the importance of data and research to really augment us defining what our needs are and how we could access the loss and damage fund, and really demonstrating some of the some of the Caribbean solutions like parametric triggers that could be used for the as an access criteria for this new loss and damage fund. So thank you so much. And in the open plenary discussion, feel free to continue the discussion. I think when we planned this, we should have probably done this like for a 3-hour slot instead of 2.5 hours because it's such a rich discussion. And I want to now move on to Ainka for her question. And it's related to the work that CANARI has been leading on in terms of civil society and community engagement. So Ainka, how can civil society and communities be more engaged on climate justice and debt issues? And what are some of the key priorities and advocacy messages should we in the Caribbean be sharing in the lead up to COP29 and beyond?
Okay, so thanks very much, Sasha, for that. Maybe I'll just turn up my volume so you can hear me okay. So greetings from Trinidad and Tobago. I'm very pleased to be here and joining this esteemed panel with all of these experts who I think know a lot more about issues around loss and damage and finance than I do. And also thanks to Sasha and the team at Climate Analytics Caribbean for inviting me to join the discussion. So in terms of the question that you asked, the first thing I wanted to mention, like loss and damage and debt, can seem very complex and intimidating for the average NGO, civil society actor, or grassroots activist to engage with. And often when you hear persons talking about loss and damage finance and debt sustainability, for example, the Bridgetown initiative led by Prime Minister Motley, the focus is typically on what governments are doing, how private sector investment can be leveraged, or what global funds like the Green Climate Fund, JEF, and big banks like the World Bank, IMF, etc., can do to support financial reform. I think there's currently not so much discussion around loss and damage at the community level and how finance can better support local recovery and resilience building in just and inclusive ways, and how growing debt limits our island's ability to respond. But this is exactly, I think, the level that we need to be engaging with as part of these discussions. And this, I think, will empower civil society and communities to engage more. So I'll give a concrete example. So let's take Hurricane Beryl. And the SVG government, along with other governments in affected countries, are working to support recovery, for example, in Union and Mairu Islands in the Grenadines, where 90% of buildings have been damaged or destroyed and residents displaced. But who's at the table in making decisions about rebuilding, restarting the local economy, providing social protection to those in need? replanting damaged mangroves, or putting in new breakwaters to reduce future impacts? And where's the financing coming for all of this? So we really need to think about how local residents, small businesses, various community groups and NGOs, like Sustainable Grenadines, 𝗗𝗺𝗴𝗲 that are based in these islands, or the local chapters of groups like, that represent persons with disabilities, etc., how we can engage them and ensure they have a voice in these decisions. I think part of it is that we need to raise awareness. So dialogues like this are really important so people understand the issues and have a better grasp of, what are the drivers, what some of the data and reports that they can look to. And we also need to build capacity and empower them to effectively engage. So we also need government to recognize that civil society has a role to play and allow them a seat at the table to be part of these decisions. I think we also need to support each other and work collectively in this process. And that's why initiatives like the Caribbean Emancipation 2030, for example, on debt justice, that's being led by the regional NGO Caribbean Policy Development Center, CPDC, is very interesting. There's also the work that we're doing as part of the Caribbean Climate Justice Alliance, that the Caribbean Natural Resources Institute that I work with, CANARI, is convening and has over 50 allies, including Climate Analytics Caribbean and others. And we have a working group, for example, on adaptation and loss and damage. And this is helping to bring people together to discuss these issues and figure out how to address them. So this can really help mobilize civil society and frontline communities, and I think join up small, somewhat disconnected efforts so they can have impact on a larger scale and advocate loudly for the changes we want to see in terms of climate and debt justice. And I can add some links in the chat around some of these initiatives that I just mentioned. And I think kind of looking to COP29, where we have these key negotiations on the new climate finance goal and how we operationalize the global loss and damage fund. I think we really need to talk more about how to localize finance to get it where it's most needed. So how are we getting it to the poorest households, to disadvantaged women and youth, to persons with disabilities, the elderly, and in indigenous and maroon communities that are on the front lines. I think the data that we have globally sort of indicates that 10% or even less of climate finance is actually reaching those on the ground, including the most vulnerable and at risk. So we need to advocate that along with doubling finance for adaptation, because we already have this imbalance in funding for adaptation to impacts versus mitigation of emissions, that at least 25% of total adaptation finance is allocated for local efforts led by frontline communities, civil society organizations, and other local actors. And I would say the same should be happening for the loss and damage fund. We need to make sure we have a window that's specifically geared to providing funding to communities on the ground that are affected and ensuring simplified and direct access. And I think maybe the other thing I wanted to note around financing as a key message is that we really need it to be predictable, patient, and transparent. We need funding for 5 or 10 year periods and not these 2 to 3 year projects that we often see. And we need people there needs to be a recognition that we need to build up capacity as we provide this funding and not assume that all of the capacity constraints around projects and financial management, auditing, etc., are going to be solved before we get people with money. I think taking an approach where we design mechanisms for grant making and capacity building at the same time are important so we can address those issues. And we also want to make sure that funding doesn't have all these predetermined priorities, which are not necessarily aligned with local needs and priorities, so that there is this transparency that we're funding what people really need on the ground. And so I think those are some of the key things that we'd want to see coming out of, these conversations and in the ways that civil society and frontline communities can, get more engaged. in these processes and really try to advocate for ourselves and for better financing to really tackle the impacts that we're facing from the climate crisis, especially as there's been such slow progress in reducing emissions, and I think keeping that 1.5 degrees Celsius goal alive. And that's really condemning us to more extreme impacts and loss and damage into the future.
Thanks so much, Ainka, for that, and to really, outline the importance of advocacy by civil society and communities to advocate for what our needs and priorities are, on how to address loss and damage, and what we need to do to access, climate finance and loss and damage finance as well. And also highlighting some of the initiatives that are happening around the Caribbean, including the Caribbean Climate Justice Alliance as well. So our last panelist is Kevin, and I'm going to ask Kevin to be brief. But Kevin, I know you in your presentation, you did provide an outline or overview on debt sustainability and some of the recommendations on how to address debt sustainability and loss and damage. But I just wanted to ask, how could governments, financial institutions, and development partners really support recovery and resilience building efforts while also minimizing debt for vulnerable communities and sectors in the Caribbean? And what are some of these solutions or initiatives that are already being championed or implemented? And what more do you think should be done?
All right. Thank you. Preeya gave a very comprehensive, so I just want to build on where Preeya ended. For starters, a lot of times in the region, we are reactive. So we attract funding for capacity building and actually trying to treat with debt collection to make our business case after the event. All right. And I say it to say that case in point, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, post-burial, there is now a greater concerted effort, for a number of stakeholders and partners to really pump resources and building capabilities and capacity to really help strengthen a number of the type of disaster responsive type of approach that's required. This is not removing the efforts that has been done prior in terms of having this contingency fund, having a fiscal responsibility framework, among other things, right? But I don't know if it's oftentimes a case where we're striking, the fire while it's hot or the pot while it's hot. But I say to say, we could no longer escape making the investment in, or even trying to attract resources, grant resources to build up capabilities in our islands, to really help gather that data, make those business cases, and actually be able to continue the advocacy. CRIF is a model that was created as a result, right? And it's now we're now seeing the benefits of CRIF. CRIF is expanding. Recently with burial, we recognize the utilities in Grenada would have bought CRIF protection, and they too were able to benefit in terms of being able to get immediate financing and respond. So similar to what Preeya spoke about in terms of the type of parametric type triggers, I am fully in support of it. The regional banks are seeing the utility and importance of the debt clause, and they too are promoting it now in their debt instruments. So that is also a way forward. And again, it's a result again of advocacy by our leaders in Grenada and also in Barbados. The debt for climate swap is trending. We've seen evidence of 𝗗𝗶𝗶𝗵𝗵𝗲. That too is trending. And again, we need to know, I think my colleague, Ms. Granderson, spoke also about building awareness. I think if we can get our people to become even more aware and ensure we have the relevant persons at the table, simple things like climate resilient homes. So in a number of our territories, we are not still, while we have building codes, the to actively, I know one may argue the cost of construction material, but governments have to show leadership even in terms of what incentive they can give for the importation or use of climate resilient construction inputs. All right, so on balance, I think the presentation, when you circulate, has in some great ideas that it have to be a collaborative effort, and it also have to be, it's no longer business as usual. So data, I'm a fan of, because we're doing our exercise and we're combing through different reports, or by extension, we're drawing on the tacit knowledge of those who are working in the field. So while we will have a useful output, we have to ensure that we impress upon the stakeholders on the importance of data. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kevin, for that, and really expounding on the importance of data here. And I think that's a need that we've all faced and recognize the need for data in order to make informed decisions, especially related to finance, to debt, sustainability, to climate action as well. And we have a few minutes left, so I want to just ask a final reflection question for all the panelists. You know, and you have just 1 minute to respond very quickly. So the question to all the panelists are: inadequate response to loss and damage has stymied the Caribbean sustainable development. Do you think this statement is true? And why is it important to you personally to help advance enhanced action on loss and damage for our region? So we could go in order of speaking. So I'll call on Alana.
Thank you, Sasha. I think, you know, the impacts of loss and damage have unquestionably stymied the region. I think that most of the impacts, and this is not a criticism, but I guess you have several parts burning at the same time. But most of the impacts, I think, have focused on, you know, the impacts at the state level and how, you know, how that has impacted the GDP and so on as the state as a whole. But as in even that simple observation, as well as, you know, Kevin would have indicated that we're spending most of our money servicing debt. So implicit in that is that we're not spending it in development. So we are essentially our development is being retarded, and it's the most vulnerable in society and who are being impacted. And for me, it is critical to bring the human, and not only the human, but the cultural element of this also into more into the discussion, because we have a rich history, a rich culture, a lot of which can be eroded by impacts from loss and damage. And simple things like our right to education and the development of our human resource and our ability to compete globally and so on. So I guess what I'm saying is that in addition to and more as the discussion comes, you know, into what are the next steps for the loss and damage fund, and so the human component needs to be, and the human rights of the peoples and communities of the region, because if we lose this, you know, we lose a tremendous part of us. And for me, I'm happy to see that in the discussion, one of the criticisms or one of the shortcomings that states are hoping to infuse into approaches in terms of disbursement and the operationalization of the fund is incorporating a human rights-based approach into how the World Bank does its business, because it's not historically taken that approach. and it is critical and fundamental for the vulnerable, the vulnerable of the most vulnerable and particularly our children, and because they I don't know what we're bequeathing them. I think that's
Thank you. Thank
yeah.
you so much, Alana, for that. And I want to ask Preeya, and specifically, why is it important to you to personally help to advance enhanced action on loss and damage for our region?
So, Sasha, I want to begin answering the question by saying that disasters and loss and damage is not something new in the Caribbean. It is, in fact, our lived experience. Historically, we have been dealing with loss and damage and disasters. And personally, for me, that's why I feel connected to this particular area of research. We've had a lot of innovations come out of the region that were mentioned before. We have the parametric insurance and we have the debt pause clause as things that we have pioneered in the region. I want to take it more to the community level and list some practices that have helped us build our sustainable development to these events. And this is where my research personally comes in, where I feel that these initiatives need to be documented and be shown to the world that these are things that we are doing. So Dominica, after Tropical Storm Erica and Hurricane Maria and the devastating impacts, they declared that they would become the world's first climate resilient country. And that's no small feat. And there are many government level initiatives, but I want to highlight the initiatives from the indigenous people that are being used in building the sustainable development and climate resilience. So when disasters occur, we have a loss of electricity and internet. And so it becomes difficult to establish early warning systems and for response in terms of accessing persons who may be in trouble. So the indigenous persons in Dominica have their historical trails across the forests. And when there's a power outage or internet outage, they use these trails for early warning systems, as well as to access persons who may need help, who may need to be evacuated or need supplies taken to them. So we are a region. Yes, we are susceptible to loss and damage and disasters, but it's in our DNA and we are pioneering solutions in this area, and we need to show the world these solutions. Of course, learn from the world and educate the world on strategies that they can adopt.
Thanks so much, Preeya, for that. And I want to ask, the same question, the final reflections to Ainka. Why is it important to you to help personally advance and enhance action on loss and damage for our region?
So, I mean, that's a great question. And I guess maybe to personalize it, I'll say that I'm half Grenadian and half Trinidad. And when Hurricane Beryl hit this July and devastated the Grenadines, I was deeply concerned. I think this also made me reflect on the fact that it's almost exactly 20 years since Hurricane Ivan devastated Grenada in 2004. And what progress have we really made? Are we in a better place? And I think the truth is that these major hurricanes and storms and other climate extremes are severely setting us back every time they hit. I think both Mr. Hope and Dr. Mohan have highlighted, I think, quite clearly how various islands' debt to GDP ratio have been increasing over the years. And I know that, for example, Grenada, along with 11 other Caribbean islands, are currently among the top 20 most indebted cities globally. And of course, you can imagine if 60% or more of your GDP is public debt, this really limits the amount of finance that's available to, for sustainable development, including education, health, infrastructure, environmental protection, etc. So I think it is extremely critical that we address this urgently and also think about taking this whole of society approach that doesn't just focus on what our governments and private sector can do and technical experts, but also brings in the communities and those on the front lines, and that we ensure justice and a rights-based approach for our citizens who have contributed the least to the emissions, but are bearing a really heavy burden in the face of the climate crisis.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you so much for that, Ainka, and to really personalize why loss and damage is important. And it's not just, you know, because it affects another island, it doesn't affect us, because we have family and friends and colleagues and so on that live there that are being affected by these disasters. And every year this happens. So thank you so much. And Kevin, last but not least, if you could briefly provide your reflection on why is it important to you personally to help enhance action on loss and damage for the Caribbean?
Personally, also a Caribbean man. Vinci, Trini, some Tishan, Bajan, among others. And this just has to do with my collective work and life experiences. And for me personally, I see it as the glass is half full. I mean, today I'm leaving here benefiting from the inputs from each of you. And I feel empowered to want to go and continue to advocate, to do research, and to be part of the change I want to see. I think Ms. Granderson saw the positive that's in her contribution. As a Vincentian, we've been hit within most recent time by a volcanic eruption. And you had displacement of upwards of 25,000 people. At our home, while we lived in the green zone, I saw the Vincentian spirit came to life, where my household, among others, both abroad and at home in St. Vincent, accommodated his brother and sister. So while there was displacement, the spirit of resilience, the spirit of rebuilding, I'll give an example. We had some an indigenous family staying with us. And on the lands that we have, that's just, laid to waste. Within 6 months, they were produce. And this indigenous family came, and while we shared and exchanged stories, they made a living and turned what was unproductive land into productive lands, right? And it spoke volume to me that as a region, we have to continue to innovate. We got to continue to document and cherish our heritage. And we don't have a choice, colleagues. And I'm committed to the task. So I'm really looking forward to working with each of you and those within the audience.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much to our panelists for your, reflections, for your responses to the panel questions. And, this discussion has been quite rich and quite interesting, and we've gotten a lot of comments and feedback in the chat. So I'm not going to do the Menti. I'm going to actually, when we send out the thank you email with the slides, with the recording, I'll also share the link for you all to please complete the Menti, because that will help to inform the research that Kevin is doing right now. So we'll do that, and then what we'll do instead is actually move on to the open plenary discussion where, the audience could start engaging with the panelists, asking questions, providing comments, and so on. But before we do that, I would like all of us to, take a family photo. So I'd like if we all could turn our video on and smile for the camera, and I'll ask if Maya could take a photo.
Hi everyone. So it's 3 screens. So I'm gonna take one screen at a time. So first screen, everybody just smile until I say stop, please. So first screen, smile. Right, second screen, smile. Oh, everybody's camera isn't on. Everybody's cameras isn't on. Can you please turn on your cameras? Okay, I got the photos. Thanks. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Maya, and thank you to everybody for accommodating me. And yeah, now we're on to our plenary discussion. And please share your questions or comments in the chat or raise your hand if you'd like to ask any questions directly. So I know we have some questions in the chat, so I'll ask if Bianca could select some of them. And in the meantime, if anybody has any, if they want to raise their hand and ask any questions, feel free.
Thanks so much, Sasha. So we actually received quite a bit of questions from our guests when they registered. And I am trying to choose which one. They're all fantastic questions, but I think this one is quite interesting. How will fisherfolk whose fishing grounds become part of an MPA be recompensed? Or will there be an increase in crime necessitated by the need to eat and pay bills? The impact is greatest on those without assets. So those making the impactful decisions have no experience. Actually, there's actually one other question that came before that. Yes, sorry about that. How urgent is it to act in the Caribbean against climate change, and what action would be taken?
So I guess that is a broad question. So I could ask anybody from the panel to weigh in.
I guess if I could start, I think without a doubt, I mean, listen to this panel alone and in our lived experience, it is a critical issue for the Caribbean. I without knowing the specifics of but I do know one of the responses to climate, and it's actually about a climate and biodiversity related response, because we now know that what they call blue carbon systems are also tremendous sinks and absorbers of both carbon and heat. So there's been a lot of the 30 by 30 challenge, which the Convention on Biodiversity, which most Caribbean states of members are. So on one hand, you want to conserve your marine biodiversity, which is also linked to things like that for nature swaps and so on. But on the other hand, one of the challenges we have been seeing is the designation of parks. And I can think of one in particular in the Grenadines, for example, where the entire fishing grounds of the island was subsumed. So we have competing responses. On one hand, the state wants to ensure their climate and biodiversity responsive, but this needs to be done in a participatory way. And one of the challenges we have in the Caribbean is we tend to govern top down without the involvement of communities and so on. So I think one of the mechanisms for balancing things are two mechanisms. One, we have the 𝗟𝗀𝘀 agreement, which many of our states are part of, and those which are not should really really get on board, because that will ensure a more participatory governance and decision making. But the other, and this is both Belize and Barbados are utilizing, this is marine spatial planning, which is part of their Debt for Nature deal, in which, yes, there's the debt was forgiven to do some certain amount of conservation. I can speak more to Barbados because that's where I have a little more experience, is that they're utilizing some of the funding to develop an ocean policy and marine spatial plan. I'm not saying that with a marine spatial plan, everybody's going to be happy, but we're just trying to ensure, or the objective should be to ensure there's a bit more equity across populations, especially vulnerable populations. So, not saying we're doing our NDCs and our biodiversity goals, but your population is not able to make a living and so on. So I guess that's one part of the response. So I'll just leave it there.
Thanks so much, Alana. And I just want to jump quickly to the question that I was actually quite interested in. Seeking methodologies, case studies that support qualifying or quantifying informal isolated cash crops, including wild foods for security. The person asked if these exist, how will they be brought into the 𝗗𝗂𝗶𝗃 equation? These questions are based on climate risk work being completed in Westmoreland, Jamaica. Would anyone like to take this?
That would be probably a question for me and Kevin. And the DALA is damage and loss assessments. That's the methodology that was developed by the UN Economic Commission for Latin America and Climate Change and the Caribbean, UN ECLAC. And you know, we utilize this when we're trying to assess or quantify the impacts of you know, natural disasters on countries. So the thing about the DALA is that, you know, usually you do a DALA as soon as probably within 2 weeks of an event, and then you do the DALA probably 6 months or a year afterwards to see the changes if it's related to I'm just randomly if it's related to livelihoods and so on. So then you would get to quantify those changes. But the DALA is a methodology that can be improved or refined or updated in order to measure specific aspects. So if you want to look at, you know, food security or water, access to water, or access to electricity, you are able to incorporate that within that methodology. And unfortunately, I'm not seeing anybody from UN ECLAC here, but so they could provide more insights into it. But the good thing is the DALA is a methodology that can be refined to incorporate these views. So it's a lot more responsive for that moving forward. So it could be one means of how we could improve on how we do our assessments of loss and damage. So I don't know if Kevin, you have anything to add on that question?
Nothing from me, Sasha.
Okay. All right, thanks so much. And I'm seeing that there's a hand up, Danielle Myers. If you feel free to come in and ask your question to the panel.
Hi, morning again. I came in a bit late, so I'm not sure if this was mentioned, but I was wondering if we have an estimated target that we're working towards for the loss and damage fund. So we know there's a climate finance gap from the high level panel, expert panel, the 2 trillion gap for adaptation and mitigation. Do we have estimates? Are we working on estimates for how much we might need annually for a loss and damage, so that we can know, you know, we have, as you said, 700 million right now, but how far off are we from the need? Thank you.
And so I'll call on Preeya and Ainka to weigh in on this very, very relevant question, which is what will be discussed at COP next month.
So I can jump in, and then Preeya can probably flesh it out a bit more. But what I'm aware of is that a global consortium of NGOs has basically been calling for 5 trillion per year, at least, being put into supporting mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. So I think, you know, how that's going to get split and whether we're even going to get close to that in terms of commitments in the next 10 years, which I think is the period that's being negotiated, we have to see. But I think we should definitely be ambitious. And because based on our estimates, we already know from NDCs, NAPs, etc., that we do have trillions of dollars already sort of known to be needed. And clearly, when we think about how much damage a single country can receive from one unique event, which can be billions of US dollars. Clearly, we need trillions, and hopefully we're able to push hard and negotiate for that.
So that's actually a very good question. And I'm happy Ainka gave a number because I don't have a number to give. But there are persons working on the numbers out there. And as Ainka said, it's in the trillions. What makes loss and damage very difficult to estimate our needs? We'll go back to what was presented. So we're not just talking about economic loss and damage. So economic would be damage to infrastructure, to homes, to businesses, but we're also talking about non-economic losses and how we quantify non-economic losses. Losses to our mangroves, losses to coral reefs, losses to fisheries. And these are the things that are very much more difficult to quantify. Also, we're not talking about just disaster impacts, extreme weather events related to climate, but we're also talking about slow onset events. So sea level rise and the impact of sea level rise, the economic and non-economic impacts. So these are the challenges faced in estimating, to put in a target on loss and damage and what that fund would look like, how much should go into that fund. And well, as Ainka said, it's in the trillions, and all we can do as researchers and persons engaged in the conversation is work towards building the data sets by engaging with the communities so that we are able to provide the information in terms of economic and non-economic losses and the immediate and long-term impacts.
Thanks so much for that, Ainka and Preeya. And yes, we know that there's work being done on what is that quantum, but we do know that it's in the trillions. So definitely the $100 billion goal, climate finance goal that we barely met, probably not at all. That's clearly insufficient. So we have another question, and I think it's quite interesting, and it's focused on insurance and the loss and damage fund, but I want to kind of have Kevin tease out the relationship with insurance to how we undertake debt sustainability in countries in relation to loss and damage, and not just only focus on the fund. So the question is, in the insurance industry, building new and retrofitting existing structures for greater resilience is considered a less risky strategy than paying for the repairing or rebuilding of much less resilient structures after disaster. So wouldn't it make sense for the loss and damage fund to take this into account in its, when we're developing the fund and provide mechanisms to address this fact? So I'm asking on that level, and then also nationally, and how can we incorporate that into our loss and damage strategies as well?
Okay. Permission to start, I guess, from the home level to the international.
Mm-hmm.
At present, and even from the data and reports from the damage and loss assessments, from the post-disaster needs assessment for several of our countries, we recognize government had to absorb a lot of that cost related to housing, right? Because in many instances, due to homes in some cases not being built resiliently, or just the sheer impact of how severe those storms are. And there is discovery where a number of the homeowners do not have insurance, especially if it's a situation where you do not have a mortgage tied to your home. So in instances where mortgages were already paid off, you have instances where homeowners are complaining even in terms of the cost, because subsequent shocks also mean that insurance companies are going to adjust the cost of insurance upward, right? I happen to be the son of a contractor, and I'm here trying to help my dad problem solve. I'm like, hey, Dad, what if we get into supplying, climate resilient inputs? And what if we get folks to build more or to design more climate resilient homes? So between my dad and the Development Planning Board, among others, that I would engage in stakeholder engagement, while we have on the books, for building, like revisions to our building codes to accommodate, category 3, category 4 in some countries, or even now they're contemplating category 5 hurricanes, just to meet that standard, right, or to police that standard is going to have impact. I agree with the person who shared that I'm here advocating already, because I want to be part of that change around ensuring and finding ways in which we can find the right fiscal incentives and financing to accommodate and to allow folks to either rebuild post-disaster in this instance, but also for first-time homeowners to get the benefit of actually getting to build resilient homes. Or in instances, and again, just from the tacit knowledge of some of the builders, create systems with even their household that you have the equivalent of a bunker, right? And those are innovations that are already in place by a number of our contractors and homeowners in the Caribbean. As a result of the shocks, we see anecdotal evidence of that in Anguilla, for example. I'm an advocate, and Preeya hit it, for parametric type insurance. I would continue to promote that. A number of our member governments also recognize that you have to really sit down and risk weight your exposure to hazards, and also bring something to the table. So it means having contingency facilities in place where you set aside some proportion of your limited revenue, or even finding, I know some countries opted to put, let's say, like a hotel room levy as a way of trying to fund climate resilience. I think 1% of the value-added tax that was introduced in St. Vincent and the Grenadines was meant to assist in helping to fund a contingency fund. I know in some other countries, due to the tourism sector, how buoyant and the demand, even finding innovations to help to fund your first response, which is to have to draw down contingency funds. Funding your parametric insurance is key, in addition to a number of the utilities. We have to find, as I said, ways and means to incentivize. So I guess this is where the private sector comes in, and finding better ways to pool. And this is on the private sector and home insurance side, ways and means to really incentivize folks to want to build more climate resilient homes. I'm aware Republic Bank is doing a tremendous job in trying to also create funding for investments and such, and we welcome more of those initiatives. I believe change starts with us, so that's why I started home first. On the international level, I'm hopeful, and we're looking forward to the deliberations at COP29 to really see where are we with respect to some of those deliberations on insurance. But, to respond to the contributor, I'm with you, sir, and we have to find ways to innovate and get in and incentivizing our people to make that investment, and not necessarily scaring them to death, but really, enabling them to see the benefits of that investment up front. Or build your bunker, Sasha.
Thank you so much, Kevin. So we have about 15 minutes left. I think we can take 3 more questions at maximum 5 minutes response each. This question I thought was quite interesting. What mechanisms are in place to guarantee that the funds are equitably distributed and that the voices of local communities are included in decision-making processes? Is there anyone particularly interested in taking this? Ainka, Alana?
Yeah, I can jump in here and take this one on. So I think one of the things that I've seen recommended, and which I think is actually a useful suggestion, is making sure that there's a small grants window as part of the Global Loss and Damage Fund, for example, so that you really ensure that there's this kind of simple, direct access for the people who are on the front lines and most being impacted by whether it's a climate extreme or related kinds of loss and damage. And I think as we think about how a window could function, I think one of the things is I'm aware that there was an official letter that was sent in and signed, I think, by over 350 civil society organizations, I think in April or May of this year when the Loss and Damage Fund Board was meeting, talking about that there was a lack of participation and representation from a broad enough group, including civil society, and that there needs to be more inclusive mechanisms as part of the process. And so I guess we'll see if the sort of governance mechanisms in terms of overseeing how things will work will include more civil society observers and representatives, for example, to ensure there's voice in how decisions around allocation, etc., is going to happen. And I think also an interesting point, and this kind of builds off of the discussion we we're just having about insurance and those types of things, is I think funding actions that are going to help us to build back better should also be, I think, something that we're really focused on as part of the type of funding that we're providing. So it's not just immediate relief, but how are we actually trying to build long-term resilience? So with people just talking about, building to codes, we can withstand major hurricanes. There's also things like thinking about the types of actions, whether they're supporting, the blue-green economy and development of sustainable livelihoods, whether we're, climate-proofing various sectors and infrastructure. So, I think we need to be really thinking much more innovatively in how we address many of these issues. And we need to try to really think about what are the needs on the ground and how we're addressing those, because that often gets lost in the conversation and all of the political fighting and negotiations around some of these big global funds.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ainka. I wanted to address this question in the chat from Chandel. How does debt refinancing play out with a push for climate insurance that may not be accessible to SIDS? Preeya, would you be able to jump in? And then we can perhaps go to Kevin. Thank you.
I'm not sure how to answer that. I'll let Kevin go first.
Bianca, just to repeat the question, the latter part of the question. So I heard debt refinancing.
How does debt, no problem. How does debt refinancing play out with the push for climate insurance that may not be accessible to SIDS?
We have debt refinancing is negotiation that you have bilaterally with your creditors, right? So you have more degrees of freedom or more degrees of persuasion going that route. Having sat in a few, usually creditors would love to see evidence that post refinancing, you ought to be in a better fiscal position. You ought to put measures in place to be more prudent. And what we've seen in the space where we marry climate change and debt sustainability or debt management is one where they also want to see you put in place the type of legislation and policy frameworks, or even have the capacity in-house to actually demonstrate you're going to do something different from the past, right? So debt refinancing, from that perspective, I can't speak intelligently about the latter, right? But I am a fan of the prior in the sense that, yes, we prepare, we collaborate at the CARICOM and other levels, Latin American, Caribbean levels, to advocate for policies in the international forum. But they say charity starts at home. And we have to be willing to demonstrate that we want to be the change. Grenada have shown itself 2014, 2012 IMF program, where they were leading with the debt clause, among other innovations, even in terms of the social partnership. We see that model was replicated in Jamaica. We saw that model replicated in Barbados more recently. And what that has engendered is, colleagues, a sort of now evidence that we're quite capable and have the capacity From the Grenada experience, they were able to reduce their debt upwards of 100% debt to GDP, as low below the 60% target or within the 60% target. And that has enabled this current administration some breathing space and fiscal space to be able to respond to the shock of beryl. Right? So, and creditors are businessmen and women, they're countries. So you have creditors, commercial creditors, you have creditors in terms of bilateral with countries, and you have multilateral creditors. So how you engage them differ. Once we demonstrate that we're able to improve our fiscal balance or balance our budgets, post-shock or pre-shock, we're in a better position to be able to attract funding and a better position to be able to respond better, inclusive of getting the right type of insurance, in addition to even contingent type. There is a facility at the multilateral banks that I love, where you, just like the parametric insurance facility, in this case, you call it CAT bond, right? A catastrophe bond, so basically you negotiate, you put in the regulatory measures in place such that if this catastrophe happens, you can draw down on that resource. And these are, a lot of things that we are innovating in the region, and we've seen evidence. Jamaica Hurricane Beryl showed evidence that that CAT bond that they had with the World Bank was able to enable them to respond faster to the shock.
Great. Thank you so much, Kevin. And the final question that I would actually like Sasha's insights on. Sadi and Doko in the chat asked, what are the expectations regarding debt discussions in the context of loss and damage at COP29 this year? Sasha muted, sorry.
Could you repeat the question?
Sure. At COP29 this year, what are the expectations regarding debt discussions in the context of loss and damage?
So I think for this discussion on debt and loss and damage and what we're hoping coming out of COP29, is the discussion around this new collective quantified goal on climate finance. And what we're expecting is that loss and damage finance is included as part of that goal, in addition to mitigation and adaptation finance. And in addition, recognizing the limitations that highly vulnerable countries like SIDS and least developed countries have, and the issues with accessing existing climate finance, due to, a lot of, and I went through this already, a lot of, structural and systemic characteristics. And I think it was Preeya who noted that for, Caribbean countries, a lot of the Caribbean countries can't actually, they're not ODA eligible because they're considered high middle income countries, which means if you use that criteria, a lot of countries are excluded from accessing climate finance, whether it's from bilateral or multilateral funds. So that will have an impact on how much finance is accessible to them for dealing with loss and damage. And we've heard already on this cycle, this vicious cycle of debt and recovery and reconstruction and so on that we're facing. So you see how that all links. And one of the major positions from SIDS and LDCs and other developing countries is that, climate finance, including loss and damage finance, should prioritize grants and concessional finance instead of looking at focusing on loans. So it's that discussion that's there on on finance and what would this new collective quantified goal on climate finance look like, and how do we incorporate loss and damage finance in it, and how do we incorporate those debt related elements in it, noting that this is one of the forums for dealing with loss and damage finance and for dealing with debt. And we do have other forums which we've discussed, for example, and I noted we have the annual meetings of the IMF and World Bank happening now, and they're discussing debt restructuring. They're discussing this global reform, the global reform of the international financial architecture. We also have specific initiatives being spearheaded by SIDS like Bridgetown Initiative 3.0 and so on. So it's not only at COP we're looking towards, this is one avenue, but we also have other forums that are supporting this push to enable improved access and increased financing for loss and damage, which also incorporates how do we look at debt sustainability for highly climate vulnerable countries as well. So thank you.
Bianca, if I could just come in quickly on
Please,
the debt
Priya.
issue,
Sure.
while addressing, maybe the past two questions. I think it's a good way to end the conversation. I want to bring into the conversation the issue of debt cancellation. It's something that the international community is still very hesitant on, but I think we need to have these discussions, especially linking debt cancellation to historical injustices and linking it to climate justice. Because we spoke about the debt for climate swaps and the other debt initiatives, which are all well and good, but these initiatives are limited. Debt for climate swaps only solve just a small fraction of a country's debt. Many times after the restructuring of the debt, the cancellation may not actually improve the financial situation of the country. Also, there needs to be certain safeguards in place to ensure that the environmental projects are carried out properly and the benefits are met by the communities involved. So these are all the issues with debt for climate swaps and other types of debt instruments. So this is why it's important to bring to the conversation the issue of debt cancellation. Of course, very much not very popular, but I think we should at least mention it.
Thank you so much, Priya, and thank you so very much to all of our distinguished panelists. You've really contributed to such a, I think, a very enlightening, important discussion. Most definitely, loss and damage is such a vital, continuously evolving issue, and I think it's just really important to have Caribbean voices included in the discussion and to continue to empower our citizens to proper solutions for this issue that is impacting us so directly. So on behalf of Climate Analytics Caribbean, I thank you all so much for being here with us. For those of us in the Caribbean and North America, I hope you're off to have a great lunch and cool your brains from this very brilliant session. Everyone, please look out for the presentations, which we will send to you. And as Sasha noted, we have the Mentimeter survey that we would very much appreciate if you could submit. And that is it. Thank you very much, and we wish you all a wonderful day. Take care.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.